All right, so we're diving into this court filing about the case against former President Trump.
Right.
Specifically, we're looking at the government's argument that he can't claim presidential immunity
Yeah,
when it comes to those attempts to overturn the 2020 election.
absolutely.
Really fascinating stuff.
Yeah, this case really gets into the weeds when we talk about the limits on presidential power.
Right.
And I think what's really important here is the government's basic stance,
Okay.
which is that in these actions, Trump was not acting as president,
Okay.
but as a private citizen who was really desperate to hold on to power.
Okay, so how can they say that, though? Because, I mean, he was the president at the time.
Right.
So what makes these actions different from, like, if he signs a bill into law?
Right.
Which is clearly part of his job.
You've hit on a really crucial point,
Okay.
and that is this concept of presidential immunity.
Right.
So it's not a get-out-of-jail-free card for any action taken while you're president.
Right.
The idea is that it's supposed to protect the presidency itself,
Okay.
not shield the person who happens to be holding that office from facing consequences for crimes.
So there's a difference between official conduct and unofficial conduct.
Exactly.
So, like, if a president robs a bank on their lunch break,
Right.
that's not, that's not presidential duties.
Right. It's kind of an extreme example, but you get the idea.
Right.
And so in Trump's case, it's obviously more nuanced than that.
Of course, yeah.
But this is what the government is trying to parse out.
Okay.
That line between his role as president
Right.
and his actions as a private citizen,
Right.
and specifically as a candidate who was fighting to keep his job.
That's really interesting. So it almost reminds me, like, when Trump was pressuring Mike Pence to, to try and overturn the election results, didn't the Supreme Court already rule on that?
They did. They did rule on that. And they said that pressuring Pence was part of Trump's official duties
Okay.
as president. But, and this is important,
Okay.
the government's now arguing that even if it was official, it's still not protected from prosecution.
Wait, so how does that work?
So think about it this way.
Okay.
The Constitution lays out specific powers of the president.
Right.
And when it comes to choosing the next president,
Yeah.
the executive branch, a.k.a. the president,
Yeah.
has zero say. That is up to the states and Congress. That's how the Founding Fathers set it up.
Wow. They really, thought of everything, huh?
They did.
It's like they could see this coming from,
They were worried about it.
from centuries ago, this kind of power grab.
Exactly. And what makes this even more striking is that throughout American history, no president has ever claimed the kind of authority that Trump is trying to assert here. So he was really stepping into uncharted and potentially very dangerous territory.
So how does the government back up this claim that,
Right.
that he was acting as a private citizen? I mean, they must have some pretty strong evidence to be going with this, right?
They do. And they lay it out really carefully in the filing. They break down his actions into different categories.
Mm.
And one of the most significant is those calls that he made to Georgia officials after the election,
Oh, right.
where he asked them to find him enough votes.
Yeah, those caused a stir.
And the government argues that those calls were absolutely not official presidential business.
Okay, but why are those specifically unofficial?
Because according to the Constitution, states have the power to run their elections, not the president.
Right.
So by inserting himself into that process, the government is arguing that Trump was acting as a candidate who was trying to change the outcome in his favor, not as a president who's addressing some national concern.
So it's like he was blurring those lines, right?
Yeah.
Between being the president and being a candidate
Absolutely.
and using that position to try to, overturn the results.
And that's exactly what the government is seizing on,
Okay.
that blurring of the lines.
Right.
And it's not just those calls to Georgia.
Right.
They're also looking at his kind of communication more broadly,
Okay.
especially his speeches.
Right.
And you guessed it, the tweets.
Yes, the tweets, right. Yeah, those were hard to forget. He did not hold back.
No, not at all. And that's why they're such a key piece of evidence for the government.
Right.
Because, they point out how the language that he was using in these tweets, phrases like, we won in a landslide, or they stole the election, that's classic campaign rhetoric.
Right.
It's not the kind of language that you would typically see from a sitting president in official communications.
It's like he was speaking directly to his supporters
Exactly.
as a candidate, like trying to rile them up, more so than like addressing the nation.
And it's not just the language. It's also who he was directing these tweets at,
Okay.
right? So the government's making a point of saying, look, he was focused almost exclusively on states that he lost,
Right.
which again feeds into this idea that this was about overturning his own election loss,
Right.
not some kind of broader concern about election integrity.
Okay, so they're really building this case that Trump's words and actions were really driven by,
Yes.
by this desire to stay in power,
Yes.
not, his official duties.
Or personal desire.
Right, exactly. But what about, I mean, he's in the Oval Office.
Right.
He's meeting with staff. He's doing all the things that,
Right. How do you separate that?
how do you separate that out?
It's a great question.
Yeah.
And it's one that the government tries to address very directly.
Okay.
They acknowledge that, of course, Trump was physically located in the White House,
Right.
but they say just because something's happening in the White House doesn't automatically make it part of his official duties.
Okay.
It all comes down to intent and context.
Right.
And so they're saying we can point to specific conversations,
Okay.
specific actions that were very clearly part of this scheme to stay in power,
Right.
even if those conversations were taking place in the Oval Office.
Okay, but that's got to be so hard to, prove, though, right?
It is.
Because these are conversations happening behind closed doors. I mean,
Right.
how do they even know what was said?
That's where it gets interesting. So they mentioned the possibility of using redactions,
Okay.
which basically means removing parts of conversations
Right.
or documents if they're not relevant to the case,
Okay.
or if they deal with, classified information or something.
Right. Right.
That needs to be kept confidential.
Yeah.
It's a pretty standard legal tactic,
Right.
just to focus on the specific pieces of information that are admissible,
Okay.
that directly relate to the charges.
So they're saying that they're going to go through all these conversations,
Right.
pick out the parts that are relevant,
Exactly.
and use those.
Yeah.
Okay.
And they go even further. They actually draw a parallel
Okay.
between Trump's use of social media and a case called Link v. Freed.
Okay.
Now, this case dealt with the question of, how do we distinguish between someone's personal social media and their role as, in that case, a public official?
Right.
Right, because,
Yeah. Are you speaking for yourself or are you speaking for...
yeah, you're speaking for your office.
Right. Exactly.
And so it seems like they've really done their homework here
Okay.
because they have this legal precedent that they can point to
Right.
to support their argument.
So they're saying because of this precedent, and these tweets weren't just,
Right.
off-the-cuff remarks.
Right.
These were actual, calculated moves
Exactly.
in this personal campaign to stay in office.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they even point to specific examples.
Okay.
They talk about the tweet that Trump sent out attacking Mike Pence during the January 6th riot.
Oh, right.
Right. Which is particularly damning, right?
Yeah.
Because it shows this direct link between Trump's words
Right.
and the violence that was unfolding.
Right.
And so they're arguing this isn't a president who's trying to, maintain order.
Right.
This is a candidate who's willing to incite chaos to cling to power.
It's kind of amazing how they're weaving together all of these different elements.
It is.
It's like legal precedent and social media posts and,
all of it.
yeah.
This historical context.
And they don't shy away from how big this is.
Right.
Right. I mean, they're essentially arguing that these actions were not just unorthodox.
Right.
This was a deliberate attempt to subvert the foundations of American democracy. There's a lot here. It's this case really kind of forces us to ask, what does it mean to be president?
Right.
Versus just a person who used to be president.
That is what's so significant about this case.
Right.
Because, if the government is successful in convincing the courts that in these actions he was not acting as president,
Right.
that sets a very, very powerful precedent
Right.
for holding future presidents accountable.
Right.
Even after they leave office.
No more free passes. Right.
Exactly. And just think about the message that this sends.
Yeah.
It really reinforces the idea that in our system of government, no one is above the law.
Right.
Not even the president.
Okay, so let's say for a second that the government wins this argument. The court agrees Trump was not acting as president. Then what? What happened?
Well, that's when it gets really interesting for Trump.
Okay.
Because if the courts side with the government on this, he loses that shield of immunity.
Right.
And all of a sudden, he's on a very different playing field legally.
Right.
He's facing these charges like any other citizen would.
No special treatment.
Exactly.
Okay.
It really levels the playing field in a way that, we haven't really seen before.
Right.
And again, that sets a very powerful precedent for the future. The presidency is not a get-out-of-jail-free card.
It strikes me listening to all this that, this isn't just about Trump.
No,
This is about something way bigger.
it's about presidential power in a democracy. How far does it extend?
Right, exactly.
And what I find so fascinating is how they're using his own words against him.
Right.
Right. The tweets, the speeches. It's like they're saying, you can't claim to be acting as president
Right.
while simultaneously trying to undermine the very system that you're supposed to be upholding.
It's like a real life lesson in the limits of power.
Absolutely. It really makes you question how much power should any one person have,
Right.
even a president?
Yeah.
And how do we hold them accountable when they overstep?
These are big questions. This case is making us really kind of confront some stuff, some fundamental truths about,
It is
about the presidency.
high-stakes legal battle, a historical turning point, and a stark reminder, I think, of why it's so important to safeguard our democracy.
All right.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts before we wrap up? Something to leave our listeners with, something to really kind of chew on.
Yeah. Well, the filing actually said something that I think is really interesting.
Yeah.
They argue that holding a president accountable for these private actions actually strengthens the vision of the Founding Fathers. That by preventing any one branch from becoming too powerful, you're actually fulfilling their vision. So I would ask you, does this case change how you view executive power?
Wow. That's something I'm going to be thinking about for a while, I think.
Yeah.
Well, as always, thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us. And don't forget to check out our show notes. We'll have links to all the source material so you can dig in even further on your own. And until next time, keep asking those questions and stay curious.